My name is Barbra Sanderson. I'm 26 years old. And this is the story of how my family tried to erase me from existence, and how my grandfather's final words turned everything around. To the world, we were the Sandersons, polished, powerful, poised. My father, Gregory, and my mother, Eleanor, graced business magazine covers, flaunted generational wealth, and played perfect hosts at charity galas in our Santa Barbara estate. They had 2 daughters, Claire, the older one, and me. But anyone who stepped through our mirrored halls knew who was favored. And it wasn't me. Claire was the golden child, 3 years older, pampered, praised, and protected. I used to think maybe she deserved it. Maybe I was just too quiet, too reserved. But over time, I learned that in our house, silence was a weapon. And my ability to endure became the very reason they thought I could be controlled. When Claire turned 16, she got a Porsche. I got a handwritten card and a box of chocolate from a gas station shelf. When she flunked college interviews, my parents hired an entire PR team to reposition her academic narrative. When I got a full scholarship to Northwestern, my mother told me not to brag. Let's not make Claire feel bad. That was the pattern. Claire's failures were softened with money, my achievements were met with silence. When she stole my college essay and submitted it as hers, I was told she was more sensitive. When she threw a party using my guest list, my parents laughed it off. You should be flattered, my father said. She trusts your taste. But the one person who saw through the glitter and lies was my grandfather, Walter Sanderson. He was the original architect of our family fortune, the founder of Blue Horizon Hotels, a self-made titan who chose to live humbly in a wood-paneled cottage behind our estate. He never raised his voice. Never showed off. And never, not once, compared me to Claire. While she lounged indoors watching reality shows, I sat in his study, learning to read profit and loss reports and understand real estate portfolios. Real wealth, he once told me, isn't just numbers. It's knowing who you are when everything's stripped away. At 20, I remember him looking at me one fall evening and saying, "You've seen the truth of this family. That's why someday, you'll be the one to lead it." I smiled, thinking he was being kind. I didn't realize it was a warning. He passed away 6 years later, quietly, just days after I returned from a business trip in Chicago. His private physician left me a voicemail. He passed peacefully in his sleep. I stood frozen by my office window, phone trembling in hand, my breath stuck somewhere between grief and dread. Because I knew what was coming. The funeral was a photo op, black dresses, designer sunglasses, hired photographers. Claire cried exactly on cue, wearing Ralph Lauren. My mother greeted guests with her signature 2-second nod. I kept my distance, eyes locked on the coffin of the only person who ever called me capable. 1 week later, the family gathered in a high-rise office to hear the reading of the will. The attorney, Ellen Graves, opened a thick folder and cleared her throat. The room tensed. To my granddaughter, Barbra Sanderson, I leave controlling interest in Blue Horizon Hotels, the Riviera Estate, and a $3 million maintenance fund. Silence. Claire paled. My mother's jaw went rigid. My father looked like someone had poured acid down his throat. And to Claire Sanderson, a conditional trust of $500,000, subject to educational and behavioral milestones. There was a beat of pure, undiluted disbelief. Then Claire stood up, her chair scraping violently. What the hell is happening? Ellen calmly continued. Per Mr. Sanderson's wishes, this decision is supported by notarized documentation and a personal video testimony. A video. At that moment, I felt the air shift. Not just from the shock, but from something deeper, fear. My parents exchanged glances. They weren't just angry. They were calculating. I didn't say a word. I simply walked out, clutching the papers in my hand. The estate, my estate, loomed in the distance as I returned to the mansion I had never been allowed to claim. Claire drove away without a word. My mother called me that night, asking the question I expected. Are you really going to keep all of it? We could find a more reasonable arrangement. I didn't answer. The next morning, the estate's security system was mysteriously offline. My grandfather's old study had been ransacked. Files were missing. The safe had been forced open. No one admitted to anything. But I knew the truth. I had barely held the keys for 48 hours, and already the walls were closing in. My father told me I was too emotional to run a business of this scale. My mother offered to help with the burden. And Claire? She played the perfect reformed daughter, offering to make tea, asking me how I was sleeping, and looking through me like a snake in pearls. It was clear. They weren't going to fight me in court. They were going to undermine me from the inside out. And they had started already. So I did the only thing I could think of. I locked my bedroom door, dug into the filing cabinet, and searched for it, the item Grandpa told me about weeks before he died. The old watch, he whispered, frail but sharp-eyed. If anything happens, find the old watch. It has everything you need. I found it in the bottom drawer of his desk, a scratched silver pocket watch. Old, but still ticking. And then I heard the click. A hidden compartment. A tiny USB drive. And a folded note in my grandfather's handwriting. If you're reading this, it means they've made their move. This drive holds more than evidence. It holds the map. Follow it. Trust no one but the man listed below. I stared at the name, Richard Donovan. And I knew this wasn't just going to be a legal battle. It was going to be a war. The name, Richard Donovan, echoed in my mind like a warning and a lifeline. My hands trembled as I held the tiny USB drive, the weight of everything suddenly becoming very real. I was no longer just the overlooked daughter. I was the target of a coordinated takedown, orchestrated by the people who were supposed to protect me. And now, the man who once believed in me, my grandfather, had left behind the final weapon in this silent war. I didn't sleep that night. I lay on the hard mattress in my room, my eyes tracing every crack on the ceiling, listening for footsteps, for whispers behind the walls, for the creak of a lock being picked. They had already searched the safe. If they knew about the watch, they would take it. Erase everything. And then gaslight me into thinking it was my imagination. Again. By morning, I was packed. I stuffed the USB, the note, a handful of documents I'd managed to rescue from the study, and the pocket watch into my backpack. I walked past the portrait of my parents in the front hall, two perfectly composed faces frozen in self-importance. I didn't say goodbye. I drove 2 hours south to San Diego, to a modest office complex not far from the harbor. Richard Donovan's office was tucked between a tax consultant and a yoga studio. The plaque on his door was plain. Just his name. No firm. No flash. He opened the door himself. Barbra Sanderson, he asked, voice quiet but razor-sharp. Yes, I said. I believe you knew my grandfather. He stared at me for a long moment, then nodded. I've been waiting for you. Inside, his office was bare except for 2 leather chairs, a bookshelf filled with legal volumes, and a framed photo of him and my grandfather, Walter's hand on Richard's shoulder, both of them smiling at something beyond the lens. It wasn't a professional smile. It was real. I take it they've started, he said, motioning for me to sit. They've done more than start. They're trying to erase me, I said. I need help. I plugged in the USB and showed him the contents. Emails. Bank statements. Video clips. There was even a voice memo of Gregory, our family's attorney and lapdog, talking about how to fabricate a mental health crisis. Richard listened without interrupting. When the final audio clip ended, he leaned back slowly and folded his hands. This is more than a family squabble. This is a multi-pronged legal ambush. They're not trying to challenge the will. They're trying to destroy your credibility before you even make it to court. I nodded. What do I do? First, we get ahead of them, he said. You need a clean, independent mental health evaluation, not the one they're going to force on you. Then we go underground. Not literally, but professionally. You disappear until we've assembled the right team. The next few days were a blur. Richard connected me with two of my grandfather's most trusted confidants, Margaret Lang, a former financial advisor for Blue Horizon who'd resigned quietly after a dispute with my father, and Marcus Hale, a private investigator with a long history of exposing white-collar fraud. Margaret reviewed the financial files on the USB and shook her head. They've been cooking the books, she muttered. Using Blue Horizon corporate accounts to cover Claire's gambling losses, siphoning off funds for private projects under Shell LLCs. This goes deep. Marcus, meanwhile, dug into the security logs from the estate, confirming that on the night after the will was read, there was a 2-hour gap in the camera footage, and 3 unauthorized logins on Grandpa's encrypted computer. He cross-checked the IP addresses. One of them came from Gregory's downtown office. They're sloppy when they're scared, Marcus said with a grin. That works in our favor. For the first time in weeks, I felt something crack through the dread momentum. But it wasn't enough to have the truth. I needed proof that could survive a courtroom. And more importantly, I needed a strategy that would force them into the light. Because if I'd learned anything from growing up in that gilded prison, it was this: the Sandersons thrive in the shadows. I spent the nights sleeping on a pull-out bed in a guest room at Richard's farmhouse in Carpia. It was quiet, surrounded by orange groves, and filled with old legal case files and photos of Walter, smiling, youthful, unfiltered. It was strange. The man I knew was wise, patient, but weathered. Seeing these younger versions of him made me ache. He had been planning this for years. He knew what his son and daughter-in-law were capable of. He'd seen it. And he'd known that I, the girl who got boxed chocolates instead of Porsches, was the only one who wouldn't break. 3 weeks after our investigation began, we had enough to act. Richard brought in Benjamin Ward, a respected estate litigation attorney who had helped restructure Blue Horizon's assets back in 2017. Benjamin was meticulous, unemotional, and deadly. We're filing in Los Angeles Superior Court, he said. Simultaneously, we're preparing a press dossier to go out to 3 major financial outlets. We don't just fight this in court. We fight it in the public eye. My jaw tightened. Let's do it. The next morning, I woke up to find a courier envelope on the table. It was from Richard. Inside was a document signed 3 years ago, a contract opening a Swiss account in my name. The balance? $2 million. Your grandfather's emergency fund, Richard said. His final fail-safe. In case they tried to starve you out. I nearly dropped the paper. With that account, I could now fund the legal battle, survive independently, and protect myself against every door my family tried to slam shut. I stared at the balance for a long moment. Not out of greed. But out of relief. I wasn't just a pawn anymore. I was a player. And I was about to flip the board. I remember the morning we filed the lawsuit like a film reel in slow motion. The sky over Los Angeles was that particular shade of pale gray, the kind that looks like a prelude to a storm. Benjamin stood beside me, briefcase in one hand, his other clutching the official complaint, 37 pages of facts, documentation, audio transcripts, and notarized declarations. We were walking into a war zone. But I wasn't the same girl who had been thrown out of her own home, soaking in the rain and clutching a suitcase. I was Barbra Sanderson. Walter Sanderson's true heir. And now, I had proof. The complaint accused Gregory, Eleanor, Claire, and the family attorney, Parks, of document forgery, misappropriation of assets, obstruction of estate execution, and attempted reputational sabotage. And just as Benjamin had promised, that same morning, 3 major publications published synchronized exposés. The headlines were impossible to ignore. Was Blue Horizon's founder betrayed by his own family? West Coast Ledger. A $10 million inheritance dispute explodes in Santa Barbara, the Capital Tribune. Silent daughter, loud evidence, how a granddaughter took on a dynasty, Ethics Weekly. Each article included a photo of me, not the broken woman in a motel room, but the woman we'd carefully captured during a private photo shoot, suit pressed, hair tied back, calm, professional, unapologetic. My parents issued no statement. Gregory, who once boasted about controlling every headline, went silent. My mother retreated behind her usual masks. Claire, she vanished from social media altogether. They were used to controlling the narrative. This time, I took that power away. But that didn't mean the battle was over. The court date loomed. And with it came a fresh round of attacks. Anonymous rumors started to circulate. That I'd manipulated an old man into rewriting his will. That I had mental health issues. That I was obsessed with revenge. They tried to turn me into a caricature. The unstable heiress. The bitter second daughter. But I had the USB. I had the contracts. And I had the video. Benjamin called me the night before our first hearing. You ready for this? I've been ready since the day they locked me out of my own bedroom. The courtroom was packed. Local reporters sat shoulder to shoulder with corporate observers. Benjamin stood beside me, calm as always. When the judge entered, Monica Whitford, a no-nonsense woman known for slicing through high-profile family cases with brutal clarity, everyone straightened. She wasted no time. This court acknowledges the preliminary validity of the documents submitted by the plaintiff, she said. Each side will have an opportunity to present arguments and evidence. However, I will not tolerate theatrics, character assassination, or manipulation of this process. This is not a tabloid stage. This is a courtroom. I could feel my parents' eyes burning holes through me from across the room. My father looked like a fox cornered in a trap. Claire wouldn't even meet my gaze. Benjamin began with precision. He outlined the trail of misappropriated funds, the falsified psychiatric recommendation Gregory had drafted, and the tampered estate files. Then, with deliberate pause, he pulled out a USB. We also have a recorded video testimony from Mr. Walter Sanderson himself, he said. Verified and notarized, made just days before his passing, in which he clearly and calmly explains his intentions. The judge nodded. Play it. The lights dimmed. A projector screen descended. And then, he appeared. My grandfather, Walter Sanderson, sitting in his study, that same soft amber glow behind him. He wore a gray suit, his voice low, but unwavering. I, Walter Sanderson, being of sound mind, do hereby confirm that my estate, including controlling shares of Blue Horizon Hotels and the Riviera Estate, is to be passed in full to my granddaughter, Barbra Sanderson. He paused. This is not an emotional decision. It is a rational one. I have watched Barbra navigate a life without entitlement, without ego, and with great resilience. She is the future I believe in. Gasps echoed in the room. The video continued, clips of a cognitive evaluation conducted immediately afterward. My grandfather solving puzzles, answering medical questions, articulating clearly, with full lucidity. There was no room left for speculation. Then, Benjamin called our first live witness, Peterson, the family's former groundskeeper. An elderly man in a clean suit, voice shaking. I saw Mr. William Sanderson, Barbra's father, drag her out of the house by her arm. Threw her into the driveway. That was the night the will was read. I should have said something sooner. The judge's face stayed stony, but the silence that followed his words felt like judgment itself. Next came Margaret Lang. She confirmed that she had been pressured by Gregory to sign a falsified document questioning Walter's cognitive health. I refused, she said. He told me I'd regret it. The next day, I was escorted out. Claire's turn came. She declined to testify. She sat in her seat, head bowed, hands clenched around her designer skirt, her lips bloodless. Maybe guilt. Maybe fear. I didn't know. My parents tried to respond. Gregory mumbled vague accusations about family confusion. Eleanor said she was heartbroken. But none of it landed. Not against evidence. Not against truth. When the judge called for a recess, I walked into the hallway and found myself face to face with Claire. For the first time in months, she spoke. "You think this makes you better than us?" "No," I said quietly. "It makes me free." She looked at me, stunned. But behind the bitterness, I saw something else. A crack in her mask. A glimmer of something that almost looked like regret. The next morning, the judge gave her ruling. In accordance with the verified will, supported by sworn testimony, video documentation, and third-party evaluations, this court reinstates the original wishes of Walter Sanderson. All assets, holdings, and controlling interests are to be returned to Barbra Sanderson. Additionally, the conduct of Gregory, Eleanor, Claire, and Gregory Parks is hereby referred to the district attorney for potential criminal investigation. Gasps. Shuffling. My father's face turned a shade I'd never seen before, gray, then red, then pale. Me? I didn't smile. I didn't cry. I just exhaled. Like my body had finally learned how to let go of years of betrayal. The courtroom buzzed with reporters. I kept walking, one hand on the briefcase, the other on the pocket watch in my coat. The same one my grandfather carried. The same one that had opened the path back to everything they tried to steal. Outside, a reporter asked, "Barbra, will you be reconciling with your family?" I paused, turned slightly, and said, "I already did. I reconciled with the truth. And the truth doesn't need permission." In the weeks that followed the courtroom victory, the legal paperwork moved fast, but the emotional toll moved slower. I had won the battle on paper. The estate, the assets, the inheritance, and most importantly, my grandfather's name, they were all mine again. But what no one tells you about justice is this: even when you win, you still carry the scars. 3 days after the verdict, I received a call from a polished-sounding woman who identified herself as the new legal representative for my family. "Ms. Sanderson," she said, her tone dipped in fake warmth, "my clients are seeking a peaceful transition. They would prefer to avoid an appeal if you agree to extend their stay at the Riviera estate, perhaps for a few months, until they find a suitable alternative." I didn't even blink. A few months? After dragging me through mud? After painting me unstable and trying to strip me of everything my grandfather gave me? I remembered standing in the rain, soaked to the skin, holding a ripped suitcase and trembling from cold and betrayal. I remembered the words that echoed from Claire's lips, "You should have just let it go." I didn't shout. I didn't gloat. "I'm not taking anything more from them," I said. "But they will not keep anything that doesn't belong to them. As per the court order, they have 10 days. After that, they are trespassing." She paused, then tried again. "Barbra, please reconsider. I have thought enough. The answer is no." I hung up. That night, I stood on the balcony of Richard's farmhouse with a cup of tea in hand, watching the orange groves shift under the evening breeze. For the first time in a long while, the air around me didn't feel like it had a knife hidden in it. Then something unexpected happened. A letter arrived. No return address. No wax seal. Just Barbra in soft, cursive script. The handwriting was unmistakable. It was Claire's. I sat with it for over an hour before opening it. Part of me expected more venom. More manipulation. But what I read was something different entirely. "Barbra, I don't expect this letter to change your mind. I'm not writing to win you back or to beg forgiveness. I just needed to tell you something I've never been able to say out loud. I was jealous of you. Not because of our parents, you know as well as I do that their love was conditional at best. But because Grandpa saw you. He respected you. He trusted you. Not because you played a part, but because you didn't need to. You just were. When I was drowning in gambling debt, Mom and Dad didn't lecture me. They just told me to cooperate. To make sure you didn't get too bold. That if I did my part, everything would be taken care of. I believed them. I thought I was protecting what was left of our family. But I was just their pawn. I'm not asking for a clean slate. I don't deserve that. But if you're willing, one day, maybe we can meet. Not to talk about money. Not to fix the past. Just to talk. I'm returning something that never should have been taken. Claire. Inside the envelope was a small velvet box. My fingers trembled as I opened it. It was a pair of gold cufflinks, engraved with my grandfather's initials. The same ones he wore at every company anniversary, board meeting, and family photo. I remembered them distinctly, because they were missing from his things after the estate was looted. My father had taken them. And now Claire had tracked them down and brought them back. A gesture. Maybe too late. But real. I showed the letter to Benjamin to confirm there were no legal implications. Then, I typed a short message to the email address Claire had included at the bottom. Thursday. 3 p.m. Bell's Garden Cafe. No lawyers. No negotiations. Just you and me. That afternoon, I arrived early. I sat near the window, sipping Earl Grey, heart strangely calm. When Claire walked in, I almost didn't recognize her. Gone was the polished gloss, the air of superiority. She wore no makeup. Her coat was plain. Her eyes were tired, but open. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. We didn't talk about the lawsuit. We didn't revisit the screaming matches or the lies. We just talked. She told me about the small accounting firm she'd started working for in Burbank. About how she'd been attending therapy for 2 months now. About how, some nights, she still dreamt of Grandpa standing in his library, looking at her like he was disappointed. She cried quietly into her coffee. I didn't comfort her. I didn't lash out either. When the bill came, she insisted on paying. And as we walked outside, I simply said, "I don't know what the future holds. But if you want to rebuild something, anything, you'll have to start with kindness. Not to prove anything to me, but to yourself." She nodded once, then turned and left. A week later, I returned to the Riviera estate one final time. Alone. The house was empty now. My parents had moved out. Their belongings had been taken, though I noticed they left behind the portrait of themselves that once hung in the foyer. It leaned against a wall, cracked frame, dust settling on their carefully posed smiles. I walked through the halls slowly, touching nothing, but remembering everything. The kitchen where I used to sneak snacks with Grandpa. The staircase I was dragged down the night they kicked me out. The study, his sanctuary, still smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and old paper. In the middle of the library, I placed the second cufflink beside a framed photo of him and me, one he had kept behind his desk. I closed my eyes for a moment. Not crying. Just breathing. Saying goodbye. 3 weeks later, the estate was sold. I didn't keep it. Instead, I used a portion of the proceeds to establish the Thomas Montgomery Scholarship Fund, named after my grandfather's middle name, for underprivileged students pursuing business ethics and nonprofit management. I donated a large part of the remaining assets to women's shelters and legal aid foundations that support survivors of domestic coercion and abuse. I remembered what it felt like to have no one believe you. To be treated like a liability. To be silenced. That would not be my legacy. I moved to Boston. The air was colder, but it felt like peace. I rented a small attic apartment in Beacon Hill. I started teaching seminars on estate law ethics and generational accountability. I drank tea every morning on my little balcony overlooking the park, where the trees turned gold in October. One day, while speaking at a sustainability and equity summit, I met a man named Jordan, an environmental engineer working on renewable energy access for underserved communities. We didn't start with sparks. We started with long talks. Ethical boundaries. Financial transparency. Childhood stories and quiet mornings. He didn't try to fix me. He just listened. And for once, I wasn't someone's pawn. I was my own person. Barbra Sanderson, not the outcast. Not the broken one. But the woman who took everything they tried to destroy, and built something stronger. Boston became more than a place to hide. It became a place to breathe. To rebuild. To exist without performing. There were no marble floors or servants here, just the scent of cinnamon from the bakery downstairs and the soft creak of my attic floors as I walked barefoot through a life that finally felt like mine. On my 32nd birthday, I didn't throw a party. I invited 5 people, friends, not connections. 3 of them were former scholarship recipients from the Montgomery Fund. 1 was Jordan. The 5th? A soft-spoken woman named Daniela who ran a shelter for women escaping financial abuse. She called me her quiet donor. I just smiled. After we shared a meal in the small event room of a local cafe, I gave a short talk. Nothing formal, nothing rehearsed. Just a reflection. Freedom doesn't come from victory, I said. It comes from how you live once you've stood back up. There was a pause. And then applause, not loud, not forced. Just real. And for the first time in my life, I felt it deep in my chest. I wasn't surviving anymore. I was living. Later that night, after the last chair was folded and the cafe went quiet, I sat alone with my tea, tracing the edge of the old pocket watch I still carried. My grandfather's voice seemed to live inside it now, his calm, steady way of seeing through the noise. He once told me, people can take your home, your name, even your sanity. But they cannot take your integrity, unless you hand it to them. I never did. The next morning, I got an email. The subject line was simple. You won. Now what? It was from a journalist at Ethics Weekly, the same outlet that ran one of the first exposés on my case. He asked to do a follow-up. A piece not just about the lawsuit, but about what happens after. How you build a life out of rubble. I agreed. We met in a quiet bookstore cafe. He was younger than I expected, maybe early 30s, wary, curious eyes, and a notepad full of scribbles. His first question caught me off guard. Do you ever miss them? I thought about it. The house. The holidays. The illusion of family. No, I said. But sometimes. I miss the idea of them. Who I wanted them to be. He nodded slowly, as if that made more sense than I expected. What would you say to someone going through the same thing you did? I paused, then replied, don't wait for them to become who they promised they were. Don't stay in the fire just because it's familiar. Leave. Even if you have nothing left but your truth. Especially then. That article went viral. Not because of scandal, most people already knew the headlines. But because of resilience. Because it focused on what came after. The quiet part. The hard part. The real part. I started getting messages. Hundreds. A young woman from Atlanta who said her father left her out of the will after remarrying. A man from Ohio whose sister manipulated their dying mother into signing everything over. A teenager from Oregon who had just been kicked out for coming out to their family. They all said the same thing, in different words. Your story gave me hope. Hope. That fragile thing I once held like a match in the rain. Now it was something I could pass along. Not just a spark, but a torch. A few months later, I got another letter. This one was from Claire. Barbra. I saw the article. I watched the full interview online. I didn't know what to expect. But what I saw wasn't a woman out for revenge. It was someone I wish I'd been brave enough to be. I'm still in therapy. I'm paying off debts. I live in a tiny one-bedroom near Glendale now. I haven't worn designer anything in months. And for the first time in my life, I don't hate myself when I look in the mirror. I won't ask for anything. I know what I cost you. But if one day you're ever in LA and want to see me, not as a sister, but as two women trying to heal, I'd be grateful. I sat with that letter for a long time. I didn't respond right away. But I didn't throw it away either. Some scars don't need to be reopened. But some, maybe they just need time to breathe. In the spring, I gave a keynote at a business ethics conference in New York. My topic, legacy isn't what you leave. It's what you teach. At the end, a student approached me, young, nervous, bright-eyed. "Miss Sanderson," she said, "how did you know you'd won?" I smiled. Not the practiced kind, but something softer. "I didn't," I said. "I just knew I hadn't lost myself." Back home in Boston, Jordan was waiting with dinner and a ridiculous birthday card shaped like a giant lemon. "Because life gave you lemons," he said. "But you didn't just make lemonade. You built the whole stand." We laughed. And for once, I let myself laugh freely. Without watching the door. Without bracing for betrayal. That night, I opened my journal and wrote. This isn't the ending. This is the foundation. The part where you stop proving and start becoming. Because I wasn't my family's victim anymore. I was my grandfather's legacy. And I had only just begun. The day I was invited back to speak at Northwestern University, the very school my parents had dismissed years ago, I cried. Not out of sadness. Out of something more complicated. It wasn't validation I wanted anymore. It was acknowledgement. Quiet acknowledgement from a world that once thought I didn't belong. They asked me to speak to graduating seniors in the business school. I walked onto that stage in a navy blue blazer, not dripping in designer labels, but in purpose. My opening line was simple. When I was 18, I got a full ride here. My parents told me not to mention it. They said it would make my sister feel bad. The room went still. But let me tell you something I wish someone had told me back then. Your success does not require someone else's approval. After the applause faded and the flash photos died down, I stepped off stage and into the arms of the life I had built with my own hands. Jordan met me outside with a warm coffee and a proud grin. You didn't just speak, he whispered. You dismantled something. He was right. I didn't just reclaim what was mine. I'd torn apart a generational lie and rewritten it in my own language. 1 week later, I received a small, thin envelope. No return address. But I recognized the handwriting immediately. My mother. I debated for hours whether to open it. Eventually, I sat on the edge of my couch and peeled it open. Barbra. I won't ask for a relationship. I know I've lost the right to use the word daughter. I never believed Walter would go through with it. We all underestimated you. I see that now. I wanted a legacy, but what I tried to preserve was an illusion. You built something real. Claire told me you met. She said you were calm. Dignified. That she saw in you what your grandfather always did. I wanted you to know, we're leaving California. Permanently. There's nothing for us there anymore. I won't contact you again. But please know this, one day, I hope you can let go of the pain. Not for us. But for you. There was no apology. Not really. But there was a sliver of truth. And that was more than I ever expected from Eleanor Sanderson. I burned the letter. Not out of spite, but as a ritual. A signal to myself that I didn't need their words anymore, not even their regret. What they gave, what they withheld, what they twisted, it didn't define me now. I defined myself. Later that month, I was invited to a private gala hosted by a non-profit coalition supporting women in business law. I almost didn't go. But Jordan reminded me, your presence isn't for them. It's for the girl who thought she'd never be allowed in the room. So I went. And during the dinner, a woman approached me. She was maybe 50, dressed elegantly but simply. Are you Barbra Sanderson? I nodded. I read your story. Years ago. My daughter was in a similar fight with our family. You gave her the courage to speak up. She paused, then reached into her purse and handed me a photo. Her daughter, smiling, holding a law degree. She said to thank you. I swallowed hard and nodded. I didn't know what to say. But I didn't have to. That was the moment I realized something. Revenge had never been my true fuel. It was justice. Not the courtroom kind. The quiet kind. The kind that ripples. The kind that echoes. That night, I stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows of the venue, looking out over the city lights. I thought about Grandpa. About the words he whispered the last time I saw him. If they ever doubt you, anchor deeper. He had trusted me with more than a company. He had trusted me with the Sanderson name, not to preserve it, but to redeem it. And now, I was doing that, not just for myself, but for others who had been cast aside by their own families. That spring, I expanded the Montgomery Fund to include legal assistance for young people unfairly disinherited or defrauded by their families. I partnered with ethical estate lawyers, mental health professionals, and women's rights groups. We called it the Second Voice Project. Because sometimes, you don't get to tell your truth the first time. Sometimes, you need a second voice to help you rise. My grandfather gave me that voice. Now I was giving it to others. One afternoon, as I sorted through grant applications, my phone rang. Jordan. Guess what, he said, excitement in his voice. We got final approval. The state's greenlighting the renewable energy pilot. I laughed. You mean you finally wore them down? He chuckled. I just told the truth. Over and over. Until they couldn't ignore it anymore. I smiled. That was us. Two people who didn't believe in shortcuts. Who chose the long road. The honest road. That weekend, we walked the park near my apartment. The cherry blossoms were just starting to bloom. I watched the petals drift through the air and thought. This is what it feels like to arrive. Not loudly. Not dramatically. But peacefully. At the edge of the park stood a bench under a tall elm tree. I stopped and pulled something from my coat. The pocket watch. I'd carried it all these years. I opened it. It still ticked, quiet and steady. Inside was the engraving I'd read so many times. When they doubt you, anchor deeper. I sat down and whispered, you were right, Grandpa. I didn't just survive. I rose. They say the final chapter is the one that defines the story. But I've come to learn that real life doesn't end in a clean arc. It unfolds, quietly, in unexpected ways, like ivy crawling back toward the sun after being trampled. 3 years after the court ruling, the Sanderson name meant something else entirely. To the tabloids, it was a scandal-turned sensation. To Blue Horizon's board, it was stability restored under ethical leadership. And to the young scholars funded by the Montgomery Fund, it was opportunity where there used to be silence. But to me? It was no longer a name I had to live up to. It was one I had redefined. The estate, long since sold, had been turned into a historical education center for women in leadership. The foyer that once housed portraits of smiling liars now held a simple bronze plaque. In memory of Walter Sanderson, who chose integrity over appearances. Claire eventually reached out again. She didn't ask for money. She didn't play victim. She told me she was still in therapy, still working her way up at the small firm in Glendale. She'd met someone. They weren't serious, but she smiled more. I could tell. We met for coffee once every few months, on neutral ground. We didn't talk about the past. We talked about books, work, plans. She never brought up our parents. And I never asked. Some wounds close in silence. As for them, Gregory and Eleanor, last I heard, they had quietly relocated to Lisbon. Word reached me that my father was consulting on hotels again, this time under someone else's name. My mother had taken to writing local op-eds about family values. I felt nothing. Not rage. Not vindication. Just distance. And that was enough. One fall morning, I was invited to deliver a TED-style talk at a global ethics forum. The theme, reclaiming the narrative. I almost declined. Then I remembered the girl I once was, the one crying in a rain-soaked coat on the sidewalk, holding a suitcase and wondering how everything had vanished so fast. I wrote my speech for her. The auditorium was packed, cameras rolling, lights hot against my face. I began the way I always did, with the truth. My name is Barbra Sanderson. And this is not a story about revenge. It's a story about recovery. About what happens after your family calls you unstable. After they strip you of your name, your home, your reputation, and you still choose to rise. I didn't tell them everything. Just enough. Enough for those in the room who were quietly fighting their own silent wars. Enough to show them that being disowned doesn't make you disposable. That losing everything sometimes leads you straight to what actually matters. When I stepped off stage, I wasn't met with applause. I was met with understanding. People didn't cheer. They stood. Not for spectacle. But for resonance. And as I made my way backstage, a teenage girl with tears in her eyes slipped a note into my hand. Thank you. I thought I was alone. Later, on the flight home, I sat beside Jordan, my hand in his. We looked out the window as the clouds broke apart over Boston, sunlight carving a path between the gray. Do you think it's over? He asked softly. I shook my head. No, I said. But I think it's finally mine to write. In the years that followed, I published a memoir, not to relive the pain, but to illuminate the map. The one others might follow when their world collapses. The book was called Anchor Deeper. The cover? A single gold cufflink against a backdrop of storm clouds. It hit bestseller lists not because it was dramatic, but because it was true. Readers wrote in from every continent. Stories poured in from siblings cut out of wills, from daughters painted as crazy, from quiet sons who inherited only silence. They told me they felt seen. That was enough. That was everything. And on the anniversary of my grandfather's passing, I stood in the public library we'd helped renovate in his name. I placed a copy of the book on the donation shelf. Inside, on the first page, I had written, "To the next one they underestimate. You are not alone. And you are not what they say you are." Later that evening, back in my apartment, I poured a glass of wine and stood on the balcony overlooking the now orange leaves of the park. The wind was gentle. The city glowed like an open book. I reached into my drawer and pulled out the watch one last time. Still ticking. Still whispering. When they doubt you, anchor deeper. I smiled and finally closed it. I didn't need it anymore. Because I no longer needed proof of who I was. I had already become her. Not everyone gets justice in court. But dignity? That's reclaimed one step at a time, through truth, resilience, and the refusal to be erased. Barbra's story isn't just about inheritance. It's about identity. About rising after betrayal. About becoming the author of your own future. What would you have done in her place? Would you forgive your family, or uphold the hard-earned boundaries? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to follow Revenge Echoes for more true-seeming stories where dignity makes the loudest comeback.